Right. Hello and welcome to Speaking Archaeologically. And for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, allow me to introduce ourselves to you. We're an archaeological education group based partly in India and partly in the UK. That is where I am at the moment, very rainy UK today. And we deal with rescue archaeology, object analysis, and making archaeology more accessible to people beyond the ivory towers of the archaeological academia and the confines of museums. In the 10 years of our existence, we've organized various in-person and online ventures to effectively facilitate public archaeology and decolonize heritage around the world. As a part of these ventures, we've launched the Talk with an Expert series, which is what you've joined in for us for today. And it's an ongoing endeavor since the pandemic to facilitate conversations with leading experts and scholars in the field and interested students and the public. Joining us today on this venture is a very important person who sort of embodies in his teachings and writings a lot of things that we stand for as an organization. Someone who really needs no introduction if you're familiar with contemporary archaeology, or you read columns like me in The Guardian or the Daily Telegraph, or even the Times Literary Supplement. Professor Dan Hicks, I welcome you to Speaking Archaeologically. A bit of a personal anecdote, because if you, like me, were studying archaeology at Oxford, then it is impossible to even think about Professor Hicks without a sense of awe-inspiring fear, which paralyzes you sometimes. Not because he's scary at all, as you will notice during the duration of this talk. He's not scary in the least, but because two of my closest friends, both of whom have been under his tutelage while I was at Oxford, often came to me after his lectures and said, "Dan's the man." Aptly so, because he's also the curator of Oxford's own Museum of Man, which is the Pitt Rivers Museum, something which is at the center of this fantastic new book he's written, which is what we're going to discuss today. It's called Every Monument Will Fall, and we're in conversation with Professor Dan Hicks about the book. Dan, the floor is all yours.
Okay, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I mean, what a wonderful organization you have. It's a privilege to be here as a part of these conversations. And so thank you. So yeah, I guess we're going to spend a bit of time talking about my new book, which is called Every Monument Will Fall. And it's a book about, well, it has a subtitle, which is called, which runs a story of remembering and forgetting. And really, this is a story about how institutions, but also how sort of cultures at large, societies, how they sort of choose to remember and to forget. Who gets remembered, who gets memorialized, who gets sort of celebrated, and who doesn't, who gets not only silenced, but in some cases actually, dehumanized. So I guess the first thing to say would be the book obviously builds on the work I did around sort of restitution with the British Museums, which was my last book. What this book seeks really to do is to take three movements, which are indigenous and African-led movements, anti-colonial movements that have impacted upon my workplace and my working life in different ways. On the one side, the fallism movement about monuments and statues. Then there's the restitution movement, which again has a long history that sort of reaches back into the first half of the 20th century, but also the movements for the decolonization of knowledge. So whether that's statues outdoors in the civic sort of public space, or whether that's artifacts inside our museums, or whether that's the knowledge or the reading lists or the ideas that we encounter in the seminar room or the library or in conversations like this, all of those movements for decolonization respond, it seems to me, to some sort of similar entity, an entity that emerged in between the 1870s and the 1880s and maybe the 1920s. It's a period of time which is quite tight in terms of the building of sort of monuments for the purposes of sort of cultural supremacism, the looting of objects in order to put them into so-called world culture museums, and the founding of the disciplines in which we work, archaeology, but also what I call the 4As, archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture, those interrelated fields. So really the book seeks to learn from the parallel movements that we see about the ways in which sort of culture has been weaponized. And fundamentally, of course, this is about the thing that is called in the press sometimes a culture war, but which I was interested in the history of, the prehistory of. Where does that language sort of come from? And actually, it turns out that there's a long history of the weaponization of culture. It wasn't a culture war. It's not a culture war. It's a war on culture. And in exactly the same way as we're very aware in our field of how science was misused, and the fake racial sciences of the 1850s, for example, sought to use science and to use displays in the natural history museums to tell the racist lies that there were different species of human. You know, those histories are well understood, and you know, the scientists over the years, not least after we beat the fascists in 1945, those sort of narratives in, you know, in sort of museums around the world were dismantled. But often right next door, in the case of the Pitt Rivers, literally right next door to the Museum of Natural History, in the museums that dealt not with nature but with culture, with which were run not by scientists but by, you know, those of us who think of ourselves as more aware of these issues in the social sciences and the humanities. Those displays and those infrastructures that were set up in order to sort of tell the same narrative over supremacism, but not with nature but with culture, were left untouched. So we're just right at the beginning, I think, and this is really a part of the conditions for making the writing of this book sort of possible. We're right at the beginning of understanding and seeing those infrastructures of forms, as the book says, not of whiteness exactly, but of sort of cultural whiteness, and to begin to have the conversations about how to dismantle them and to see what we do with it. I think I said, in our conversation sort of beforehand, that we were going to make a comment about whether we're using any visuals in this conversation. And we made the decision in between ourselves for me not to give a PowerPoint lecture or to show images. And I think it's important for the listeners and viewers to understand why. Because in many ways, Every Monument Will Fall as a book is a book about what I want to call seeing without looking, ways of understanding without centering the visual. Because in many ways, these museum displays or the forms of the monumental we're talking about are forms of a visual economy. They're regimes of visuality, which are part of how this violence that we're talking about and these ideologies that we're discussing here, the visual is very important for how they come about, but how they are made to endure. So at the heart of the book is a holding up of one person's life, the life of a woman whose body was posthumously abused in an Oxford college, in an institution. And of course, we're not going to show a picture of that person's skull. Equally, I attempt in the book to hold up that person's life against, not the posthumous abuse, but the posthumous sort of celebration and the fating of men like Cecil Rhodes. But again, I'm not going, what's the point of sort of showing you a picture of Cecil Rhodes, yet again centering him, yet again making us look at these infrastructures of memorialization of the ideological foundations of apartheid, or of forms of sort of corporate colonialism. So we're not going to be showing visuals. We're going to be, and that's why the book also has got no pictures in it, because it's, you know, some art historians have said to me, but images are far more democratic. If you need pictures in order to get the message across. Well, I think in this case, actually, the pictures and to re-show them would risk re-inscribing that violence. So, yeah, let's give it a whirl. Let's have this conversation without seeing the pictures, without having a PowerPoint. Instead, let's have a conversation in between ourselves.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Hicks. Now, that brings me to also an idea I had while reading the very last chapters of the book, where you talk essentially about the statues again, the statue Cecil Rhodes, for example, which is, if at all you've ever been to Oxford, it's one of the most imposing things that you will come across when you go past the high street. It is something that's hard to miss unless you do not know where the Oriel College is. It's right at the top, and you will see it. You will probably also photograph it because you would think it's aesthetically pleasing, not realizing what it tries to reinforce. And that was an idea that sort of struck me while I was reading the last chapters again, which is when you look at these monuments again, specifically the statues, or when you look at objects in a museum that are often taken by colonialists as colonial requisitions or war indemnity or war booty, it always says the gift of so and so. And to me, that sort of reinforces the idea that you need to applaud the contribution of these colonialists, despite the violent actions that they may have committed. And you sort of talk about how this is a significant contribution to culture, or culture as they see it. But I think somewhere in the book, you also say it's not culture that they care about. It's about reinforcing their own images and their own ideologies, which have, if you see, sort of outlived them and recycled into these new forms of fascism and other extremism, or even conservatism, as we see it in England and indeed in the world today. So I would love your comments on that thought.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, no, that's a really important place to start, I think, So this entity, which I was sort of describing, this thing to which the parallel movements of fallism and restitution and the decolonization of knowledge, this thing that they're responding to, I wanted to try and give a name to, because it has a certain feel, vibe, and aesthetic that we recognize. We recognize, the general with the gun on his horse and the looted item in the museum, and the disciplinary, bibliography or reading list that has, I don't know, we were talking about Mortimer Wheeler earlier, that has the, the sort of, militarist, archaeologist, whether that's Augustus Pitt Rivers or whoever. We also have the sense that sometimes you can try to decolonize the reading list, but how do you take, at one point in the book, I say, well, how do you take Pitt Rivers off the reading list when he isn't on the reading list? And one could say the same in the Indian context of, Mortimer Wheeler. I'm not sure anyone really reads Wheeler anymore. They don't have to, because Wheeler's ideas have been embodied by the work that's happened afterwards. And so many of these sort of tacit assumptions, so many of these ways of seeing, ways of thinking are embodied, in our sort of disciplines in those ways. So I offer I play around at one point, with sort of what we might call this movement, but I offer the term militarist realism for it, in that this is realism in the sense of capitalist realism, the book by Mark Fisher, where he points out that the thing about late capitalism is it has a certain realism that comes with it that makes it seem like the world could never be otherwise. And that's what the militarist realisms of looted objects in museums, soldiers or generals or sort of capitalist sort of settlers in the streets, or certain forms of ideas on our reading list. That's what they seek to do. And one of the things to get to your question, one of the things that militarist realism does is it encourages us to mix up and to mistake the man for the monument and the monument for the man. So in many ways, when we talk about Cecil Rhodes, and there's a conversation we might have about, whether how often are we going to say the name of that man in this conversation? What happens if we try not to say his name? There's quite a convoluted bit at the beginning of the book where I'm really trying not to say the name Rhodes, right? And, referring to this man and that man, I do the same with Pitt Rivers. Of course, Pitt Rivers is not even, as I point out at one point, it's not even his real name. It's his sort of necronym. It's his sort of death name, which he inherits, that comes with all of this money, which was, of course, made out of empire in various ways. So we're encouraged to mix up the conversation, though, about Rhodes as if it's the man rather than an image of the man. So militarist realism makes it seem like these characters are eternal, are sovereign. Cecil Rhodes, as we said earlier on, his image, not him, but it is above. When the front of Oriel College was rebuilt in between 1909 and 1911, that image was put on the top level above the two recent sort of kings of England, the current king and the recently deceased king. So the sovereign's both alive and dead. He's at the next level above. And of course, if you go and look at that image, you will see that he wears the suit of the businessman, and he holds in his right hand the slouch hat of the imperial yeomanry. He might as well be holding a rifle, really, for all of what that says about the mix of corporate colonialism in terms of capitalism and militarism. And so these approaches encourage us to personalize the past in those ways and to mistake the monument for the man, but thereby mistake history for memory and memory for history. So, and so really the way that we can maybe, break the spell of this vernacular, colonial, militarist, capitalist, corporate violence, these forms of magic, is to begin to point out, that this is not about history, it's about memory. That, of course, archaeology is a helpful tool here, because archaeology is in some ways the very inverse of history. As archaeologists, historians will think themselves back into a certain point in the past and will very sensibly sort of move forward in time in order to tell their story in a coherent way that makes a lot of sense. For the archaeologist, we begin with the most recent layer, and we work downwards. So we begin, and this for me is what contemporary archaeology is all about. All archaeology is contemporary, and in many ways the most interesting layers for me are the layers that relate to the recent past and in the near present. But fundamentally, archaeology, like memory, works from the present into the past. This means that this is not about, when we talk about whether to restitute an object from a museum, whether to remove a monument or to replace it with something else, whether to change what's on our reading lists once in a while, or indeed seek to get rid of ideas that are on our reading list without them even having to be there. None of that is about cancelling history. It's about things moving on and our disciplines and our institutions remaining in step with our times. It's hard to imagine any other sort of sector of society, any other department in our universities, where we would be told that if somebody pointed out that there's something from the 19th century that has survived that's hurting people or is wrong or is just out of date, imagine this in the medical sciences or in criminal justice or or in physics or anything. I'm sure there are some disciplines, I don't know about the teaching of Latin or sort of things like that. Maybe there are some disciplines where not much changes, or maths, but I think they probably do as well, also change. But imagine in the law or in medicine, if things were wrong or just factually incorrect or just out of date or hurtful, and there was an effort to change them, and you were told, no, we've always done things like that, it has to stay the same. That would be ridiculous. But somehow in our museums and in these sort of disciplines, the 4As, archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture, we allow ourselves to be told that a museum is a one-way street and objects must never be returned when they're asked for on a case-by-case basis. We are told that a monumental culture is not something that can shift because we're going to cancel Cecil Rhodes if we actually make a change. No, instead, in my view, and what the book argues for, is there is a democratic right in any society and any institution to be able to shape the memory culture with which we live. And of course, in the case of Oriel College, there was a democratic vote which was made in 2020 to remove that image. It was reasserted in another vote in 2021, and then very slowly nothing happened. So the fact that a decision can be made by an Oxford College to remove an image of a colonist, and then that image of the colonist, of the colonizer, it does not move, that is a circumstance that makes the writing of this book possible. I mean, we can get onto the hope at the end of this conversation. Really, let's not lose out or sort of miss how important hope is in all of this. But that's a part of the answer of to your question, really, that this is about thinking about the relationship in between the human beings that we're talking about and their images in stone or in bronze.
And thank you for that, Professor. I was struck by the idea of military realism, which I really liked very much. I come from an army background myself, and in the post-colonial setup, I come from a three-generation army family where everybody in my family has either been a part of the British Army or has then gone on to join the Indian Army, which is a post-colonial form of what essentially was the army like in the British setup. And when you look at the ideas that are still prevalent in colonies and how they're just a reinforcement of all these very Victorian ideas of capture and killing, and also monumentalization of wars and battles, without really thinking about who was on the receiving end of the gun, as you say in one of the chapters. And also the whole idea of how easy it is to misinterpret the text. I think in chapter 3, you talk in detail about how every time a reader reads a book and he annotates certain parts of it and leaves the others ignored altogether, he essentially is dealing with ideas that sort of sing to him the most, that sort of appeal to him the most, and sort of does away with the rest of the text.
He or her, yes, exactly. He or her. Let's.
He or she.
The pronouns are important. Yeah.
That's essentially what's happened in the colonies. Like even the post-colonial world, I generally find the word post-colonial very, very problematic to use. But even the post-colonial world, that's essentially the case. There are ideas that are far dead and gone in England, so to speak, but are very much a part of former colonies, specifically countries like India, which don't really get talked about as a former colony anymore, because specifically in the UK, I think we had this conversation right before we started the talk where a white man is essentially comfortable about talking about what he did in Africa or what he did in the West Indies, but not so much about what he did in India, because Indians are sort of taken as the extension of the white even today. The way we use the English language, the way we speak it, the way we use the colonial ideas, also the way we use archaeology even today to get to a particular political reality and reinforce on a particular political ideology is very akin to how Pitt Rivers was using it in his time, which is archaeology as a military realist form or a weapon, so to speak. So I wanted you to just elucidate a little bit about archaeology, not as a discipline as we see it as contemporary archaeologists, but as this weapon against ideas or weapon reinforcing the ideas of colonialism and conservatism in the modern sense of the word.
Of course, yeah, thank you. No, that's a really, really wonderful set of ideas and thoughts, and I'll try to do them justice in what I can say. I guess maybe one place to start is thinking about that word colonialism, or post-colonialism, as you pointed out. I talk at one point in the book about how that sort of vogue for everything being post that happened at the end of the 20th century, postmodernism, post-structuralism, the linearity of history that was imagined, that of course is that sort of framing relies upon, was maybe incorrect, was maybe too not just too soon, but actually wrong-headed in the first place. I mean, is it really? I mean, just open your newspaper or doom scroll your social media and ask yourself whether from Ukraine to Palestine to the Indian subcontinent, whether we really are in a post-colonial world. A part of the answer to sort of thinking about that question would be to think about what we mean by the word colonialism. So in this book, there's a lot of exploration of the definitions and the multivalency of certain words. The whole book is organized around the different sort of definitions of the word sort of fall, and the different sort of definitions of what a monument is, and different forms of monumentalism or monumentality is incredibly important. I mean, as archaeologists, we're aware that there are many, many forms of monuments, from Stonehenge to even sort of natural places like a lake or a tree or a hill can be a monument of some sort of kind in some sort of circumstances. And sometimes sort of monuments are about the dead, are about the physical remains of the dead, and sometimes they're not. But there are lots of different ways in which falling or monumentalizing can be understood. The same is true for the colonial. So when we talk about colonialism, we often think about sort of settler colonialism. We think about the taking of land, which of course is incredibly important, as a part of the history of imperialism. But equally, so much of what we're talking about in this space is not about things that necessarily happened in sort of crown colonies, but on the margins of empire, which were actually, not the margins, but really central to especially the later 19th century colonial process. I mean, one could say that this is about the afterlife of the East India Company and the forms of the role of lutes and the role of the corporate and the militarist within the East India Company may well be, or is certainly one of the prototypes for the forms of multiple kinds of empire, the protectorates and the informal empires, what sort of sometimes the historians refer to as the gentlemanly capitalism of the later 19th century and early 20th century. This is not about simply stolen land, but about stolen art, stolen lives, stolen bodies in death, stolen climate in some ways in terms of the afterlives and the environmental effects in those ways, stolen knowledge. So theft sort of took a lot of different forms, and indeed it is the settler colonial studies fields from sort of Patrick Wolfe onwards who show us that settler colonialism is only one form of colonialism. At one point, I talk about the classicist Moses Finley and his idea of having a typology, for different forms of empire. I think that's important because there is a deterritorialized form of colonialism, it turns out, that meant that colonialism could reach all the way to the University of Oxford and to the Pitt Rivers Museum. It could reach all the way to London or to Paris or to Berlin or to New York from items or via items that were taken from India, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Australia, and indeed ancestors who were taken from those places as well. So thinking about the deterritorialized nature of colonialism, thinking about the fact that it can happen all over the place, is maybe one way in which we can understand archaeology as having its relationship to imperialism and to empire, not as a post-colonial thing that we receive. I mean, this is in some ways the very opposite intellectually. What I'm interested in, the very opposite of reception studies. This is not a past that we receive in a different world in the present, as if the past were the writer and we are the reader. It's about endurance. It's about duration. Archaeology is the science of human duration. This is about how things are made to survive, not what was sort of set up in the first place, but how it's made to endure. So a part of that is, as I say, this sort of shape-shifting range of forms of colonialism, which we and I go at some points in the book into a whole series of analogies with the ship of Theseus or the Argo, or the way in which Henry Balfour and Augustus Pitt Rivers sort of talk about the copying of form over time and the persistence of form and yet the changing of meaning, or the persistence of meaning and the changing of form, and so on. At the heart of it really is the Marxian account of capital, which of course, capital is constantly sort of morphing and changing. And that's at the heart of it. And that's, of course, spot on for the timeline of what we're talking about. I mean, Marx writing, those observations from the 1860s that are at the beginning of this process. So yeah, we just, we need to see archaeology's role then not purely as part of a settler colonial history, but as one of the things that emerges hand in hand with many, many other forms of colonialism in the past.
Thank you so much for that. Now, I completely agree with how you approach archaeology. Specifically, I loved the part where you talk about archaeology starting as a form of weapon against the colonies and the requisition of artifacts, which were done by a might is right kind of attitude towards how these objects were acquired, and then they eventually came to Pitt Rivers. And now that we're talking about Pitt Rivers, let's come to the museum, which you are the curator of. Back in 2012, which is when I was at Oxford, you'd get into trouble for saying it's my least favorite museum, because most white people are either apologists for colonialism or absolutely defend it tooth and nail. Even today, if you come to a country like England and say, oh, I'm against what the imperialists did or what the colonialists did and how your culture and language was imposed upon mine, I'm often shot back saying you're a brown woman speaking English fluently, studying here because some of us decided to give you the equality and the education and the right to be educated in the Western sciences. And we gave you trains, which not a lot of people realize here in the West were predominantly laid down in India so that raw materials could be sourced for the East India Company, and cheaper raw material could be shipped to England and sold back to the Indian markets at a much higher and exorbitant rate at the cost of our own handicraft industries being destroyed. So this sort of brings me to you. What is decolonization to you? Because you talk about that in your former book. You talk about that here. You've talked about it in other editorials that you've written and the books that you've edited. How did you come into this whole idea of, oh, I'm going to talk about decolonization, and I'm neither going to be an apologist nor a person who defends colonization, but a white person speaking from the point of view of people who were wronged instead of, oh, might is right?
Okay, thank you. That's a tricky one. Let me do my best. I think, I mean, at the end, you were talking about me speaking and, speaking for or whatever. I think that's a good place to start. So, yeah, I mean, I'm of a generation where in the 1990s, we were trained to think about how to deal with these issues and these legacies through something called being reflexive. And being reflexive was about being self-aware. It was about learning from the feminist movements, about situated knowledge. It was about the statement of positionality. But when you state your positionality as a cis masculine white man at at an elite institution like Oxford, you risk really not doing the opposite of what the is on the label, which is that you just restate it, you underline it, you remind everyone of the privilege, and then you carry on. And that's obviously not that falling apart of what Ryan Jobson, who I talk about in the book, calls the Boasian fix. And so Franz Boas, that sort of relativistic anthropology, on the surface of it an anti-racist anthropology, but still a universalizing anthropology of the 1920s, that kind of relativism was a short-term fix in some ways, he argues, which is falling apart now, because we have to do more than underline positionality. Sometimes we have to dismantle the positionality. And sometimes the world of culture, which in an older sort of language of Marxism would have been seen as a sort of superstructure on top of an infrastructure of economics and so on. Actually, sometimes what appears to be a superstructure is actually an infrastructure for certain forms of sort of cultural mechanics of that kind, for the engineering of supremacy. So in the book, what I try to, this was really, part of the reason, I think maybe, you can tell me as readers, but, one of the distinctive things about the book, I think, is the use of voice, which was my attempt to, to try to find some way of sort of dealing with that. And so the voice of the book, and the book in general, makes use of the second person a great deal, okay? Because the pronouns are very important, as we learn from the world all around us. But they're not only important in the ways that we're often told. They're important in terms of whether I talk about myself, and then the I becomes a we, and it becomes an our, and we talk about our museums and our heritage and our discipline and our subject and so on, and those that use of the first person can exclude without meaning to, or it can sort of generalize the I. It can multiply a version of the I, of the ego, of the anthropos, of man, which is a whole bunch of people that we imagine are going to look like me. And that's where the work of Sylvia Wynter it becomes incredibly important in the book, because of her crucial sort of critique of the idea of man, her historicization of this word man, this concept man, whereby one image of the human comes to stand for all of humanity, and that has a history, and of course it has a mechanics about how it works, and we're talking about that here. So instead of the first person or only the third person or so on, I make use of the second person. So a lot of the book is written in what you might call the vocative, or even the invocative at some points. And the vocative is the voice in which you might address the dead, or you might say a prayer. But also the second person, or the vocative, is a way of addressing. At one point, obviously, the book is addressed in part to my late colleague Mary Beaudry, who was a professor at Boston University, with whom I edited and wrote and hung out and thought and so on, who died over lockdown in her late 60s. But also, it's not just Mary. It is a general. It's an attempt to turn that you into as inclusive a sort of category as a we might sort of claim to do. So I hope that by the end of the book, because obviously the yous refer to people I've gone on walks with and people I've taught, and people, loved ones and friends, but also just conversations I've had in online spaces like this over the period of the time of writing the book. I hope that by the end of the book, that you also comes to encompass the reader in some ways. So we make a sort of pledge to each other as we're reading and writing the book. And that's where the metaphor that you mentioned earlier of the note-taking, of the writing on books, of the underlining, and what happens when you take a book out of the library and you've got someone else's underlining. I'm really interested in that mode of reading where you're intervening in it, and I wanted to encourage the reader, to write all over the book and to write in the margins, like it sounds like you have been doing. I mean, that's harder to do with the audio book. I should say I was forced to read this whole book out over 7 days, and so there's a whole, wherever you get your audiobooks, you can sort of download Every Monument Will Fall. If you haven't heard enough of me by the end of this podcast, then you can get another 20 hours of me sort of droning on reading my own words out. But it was a really good exercise, actually, for exactly that same reason, to use the vocative in that way and to try and invite the reader in and to think about sort of positionality or the situated nature of knowledge in a different way. So I hope that goes some way to answering what was a really important and sort of challenging question there, Shreya.
Thank you so much for that, because that's one thought I've been having since chapter 1. I think I said to you online the other night that chapter 1 remains my favorite, even though I'm well past it. And it's the one chapter that would be my takeaway, my annotation from the book. Regarding arguing with you in the sidelines, I've done that thoroughly. In fact, at the beginning of this session, before everybody came in, I think I remember saying to you that I'd want to do this in person with you when I see you next, because there's just so much to talk about. There's so many things that you want to discuss. And the use of the pronoun you sort of invited me as a reader into the fold of the book. Indeed, for 413 pages of the book, which sort of makes me realize it's an incredibly long book, I didn't feel I was reading something. I literally felt like I was walking through London with you, or through Oxford with you, and having those conversations with you in Hyde Park, for example, or in front of the Wellington Monument. And that sort of brings me back to the whole idea of monuments and what you mean by every monument will fall. Because I was reading a lot of people's reviews in the book online recently, and just a very preliminary read through would tell me that they haven't really gone past the entire thing like I have, and they've just come back on the title over and over again and said, what does he mean by every monument will fall? Is this book advocating for ending archaeology as we know it, or heritage conservation as we know it? Because I do remember there's a chapter where you talk about conservation and preservation of artifacts becoming a form of death and decay also. There's this very interesting anecdote about Balfour working with these African poisoned arrowheads and stabbing himself and realizing the poison may have decayed over time. And that sort of wanted me to touch upon the topic about what do you ultimately envisage in terms of every monument falling, or what would be the future of an anthropological museum? Because also in the British museums, you sort of say that anthropological museums are already dead. They represent a dead culture, a dead ideology. The Pitt Rivers Museum also does that, because to quite an extent, it looks like a walk into a colonialist's mind, or into his attic, where he's just blatantly collected things from all over the world, put them in display cases. And that's how the museum essentially is. It's labeled according to things and the primitiveness of things to the modernity of things, leading to the absolute white counterpart of a particular weapon or a particular object, a particular article of jewelry. So what do you have to say about every monument falling, and why would you choose that as a title of the book? What do you mean by every monument falling?
Okay, yeah, good question. Thanks, and a fair question. So the book is not called All Monuments Must Fall. It's called Every Monument Will Fall, which in many ways is just a statement of the obvious. I mean, we live in societies where look out the window, wherever you're sitting now, the world is constantly changing. There are building sites, there are buildings being pulled down and rebuilt, and we choose as societies. We have mechanisms of varying forms of democracy or otherwise that sort of govern how we make decisions, how any society makes a decision about what it keeps and what it doesn't. Sometimes in some societies, there's a choice to undertake a meticulous excavation of every last little sort of post hole or sort of ditch that might be, you know, destroyed when something is built. In some cases, there may be the preservation of a monument. In other cases, it may be changed. The point is that there is a democratic right in any society to shape our memory culture, you know, of any institution, any society. And that's something which, you know, was, you know, 20 years ago or so at the heart of how heritage management was being run here in the UK through what sort of then was the Heritage Lottery Fund, informing the work of what's now Historic England, but also around the world. You know, since the Borough Charter in the 1970s, which introduced ideas of intangible heritage, the value and significance of heritage has been fundamentally understood as one that comes out of what people think, what the living community feel and think, and what they're, you know, we hold on to things for the living, not for the dead. We care for people more than we care for things. We understand that if there is a desire not to constantly have this sort of extreme example of, you know, involuntary memory, where we're forced to have the memories of ancestors or other people's ancestors forced upon us because of a particular regime, or indeed a particular, you know, art form, or, you know, movement for the co-option of, I mean, imagine, you know, think about how people think about, you know, brutalism, and how, you know, there are some people out there, not me, but, you know, some people would love to remove every brutalist building in the world. But imagine that there's another form of, you know, art movement, which is what I'm calling sort of militarist realism, that actually, you know, built itself into the historic built environment in those ways in order to make those ideas last and make them hard to remove. This was what the Roads Must Fall movement in Cape Town showed us. What happened in 2015 in Cape Town, that sort of grassroots movement that came a generation after the end of apartheid. So there were 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds who were born after the end of apartheid, which of course was in 1994. But ultimately, was this a post-apartheid society? Because there continued to be forms of racism instilled in, you know, the everyday life of undergraduates and everybody around the university. And at the heart of the campus was this image of Cecil Rhodes, you know, which of course was a part of how those structures were made to last. So fundamentally, it's called Every Monument Will Fall because it's about what we choose to hold on to and what we don't. At the heart of the story, and we should tell people who haven't read it, you can look up the sort of detail of it in the news story in The Guardian. But at the heart of it is a story about a woman's skull, or the top of the skull, what's called the Calvaria. So the top of the skull sawn off, lacquered and polished, and sort of fitted onto with a foot, a bit like a chalice, and a silver rim applied. And this person died sometime, give or take, sort of 18 years or so, sometime around 1790, 1800. There is a story about this person that they were an enslaved Caribbean woman, although there's only circumstantial evidence for that, because the history of this person is that they were unnamed and denamed, and the denaming of that person is at the heart of it, because there is a name on the silver rim, and it's not the name of the person whose body it was. It is the name Pitt Rivers. And that refers not to Augustus Pitt Rivers, who set up the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, although he did own this object. He bought it at Sotheby's in 1884. Instead, it's the name of the grandson, the fascist incarcerated in the Second World War, who, when he was let out of jail after the end of the war, the first thing he did when he returned to his Oxford College, Worcester College, Oxford, is he donated this item to the SCR, the Senior Common Room, and a tradition was instigated that for 70 years meant that this person's body was used at first to drink wine out of over dessert, and then when the use of the item became so much that it began to leak, it was used for the chocolate. And of course, rightly, 10 years ago now, that practice was ended. What if we treat that? What if we think of that person's body? What if we think about all of the unnamed ancestral remains in our museums, our hospitals, and our universities as monuments of some kind? What if we allow their histories to be as important or even more important than the people who are constantly commemorated with the name above the door of the museum, or the name on the on the silver of the chalice, or the image up in public in sort of Portland stone or in bronze. So fundamentally, Every Monument Will Fall is about a set of decisions about how we reshape our memory culture. And I very much hope, just on the policy front, that it will contribute to the important work here in the UK of the all-party parliamentary group for reparations and restitution, who are arguing for a ban on the sale of human remains. It's amazing that the purchase of this person's body that was undertaken in 1884 by Pitt Rivers at Sotheby's would also be legal today. I mean, that's just mad, really, isn't it? To think about. We have managed to ban the sale of ivory in the UK, but not the sale of ancestral human remains. It's amazing that hasn't happened. But also, I'd say, for sort of transparency over what's in the museums. We've had this conversation over restitution, how little we understand of what's in the museums, how little is actually on the databases. How can restitution happen if the basic knowledge of what's in the museums in the first place is not shared by the curators, who essentially are redacting and controlling those collections by not doing the work of the putting of those items onto databases for the public to be able to see. So in some ways, our museums operate as if they're libraries where the only person that's going to write the books are the librarians, rather than being a resource for other people to come and use. Imagine the National Archives if all of the people that work there were the people that were writing the history books, rather than being open to people to come and understand those histories there. But that's even more the case, even more important when it comes to the unknown. Hundreds of thousands in the UK, millions internationally, surely, of human beings, ancestral remains that remain unnamed, denamed in our museums. Sometimes there is knowledge and the work can be done and the restitution can happen. And that is urgent work that needs to be happening now at pace. But we also need a conversation about what is to be done in those circumstances where the violence was such that identities or sort of provenance was part of what was destroyed. The identity was taken, the denaming happened. When I was asked to look into this history on behalf of Worcester College, Oxford, I was unable to offer them any guidance about what they should do with this person, other than what is the usual thing in our field, which is to exactly what they've done already, to wrap this person in acid-free tissue and to put them in a cardboard box and to put them in the safe, in the warehouse, in the storeroom. Surely we can do better than that. Surely, at the very least, we need to say, there you are in, wherever you are in the UK, wherever you are in the world, how near are you right this moment from somebody's ancestor in a cardboard box? And is there something sort of better that we can be doing in terms of the dignity and the consent not only in the past but in the present for what happens there? And even if there aren't any descendant communities that could be identified, what do we think as institutions is the right thing to do? What's our perspective on this? So these are the questions, without saying that sort of restitution is not important. It's absolutely crucial, and we need to do more and more of that in terms of ancestors. But we also need to look at the histories of who is actively, forgotten. So there are ways in which, I like that image of the ending of a tradition, like the abuse of a human being's body in that way, as a bit like the fall of a monument, a bit like the removal of something of that kind, that often these sorts of traditions are not as old as they seem. I mean, think about the image of the enslaver who was put up. I'm not going to say his name, and let's just try that. Okay, let's try not to say these people's names, but that image that was put up outside what is now the museum in Docklands in London, in London Museum Docklands in 1807, removed in the Second World War in 1943 and sort of put into the museum storage, then re-erected in 1997 in advance of London Museum Docklands opening in 2003 on the West India Quay, where the regeneration of that area was such that a part of that history was, the sort of desire was to remember not essentially the perpetrators of the violence of the transatlantic slave trade, and that image was again removed in 2020, the day after Edward Colston fell in Bristol, was officially removed, and in its wake will be a new artwork which is called The Wake, which is going to flip the memory culture. Caleb Brooks' intervention will be to remember those who survived, those who were at the sharp end, not the perpetrators, and to remember and to shift the memory culture in that way. That's where the hope lies, really, in all of this. So that is an example. That's a live example that we see in London of that argument of every monument will fall. Every monument will fall unless we decide to keep it, and therefore the decision making has to be transparent and has to be something that we think about, both for ancestors in boxes in museums and for images of, sort of colonists and others in our civic spaces.
Thank you so much for that. And that sort of brings me back to Oxford, the common ground between you and me in terms of this conversation. The Rhodes Must Fall movement failed and fell flat on its face in Oxford. And those of us around the globe who were following it, because we come from Oxford, were sort of shattered. Because as people from former colonies who've suffered the effects of colonialism and to date still suffer them in some respects, it was Oxford's quintessential way of not asking questions and not making any changes, which is something you also talk about in the book. Don't ask questions, don't discuss politics, don't ask questions that might lead you into trouble. Something that I was told increasingly while I was at Oxford, and back then you did not have a lot of Indian students studying archaeology. In fact, I was the only Indian student, let alone a girl, from India at the moment in the Institute of Archaeology in 2012 and 13. Which became increasingly more difficult because at the same time, the then British Prime Minister was visiting India and was taken to the site of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which is one of the grossest and the bloodiest episodes in British colonialism in India. And a lot of people were demanding apologies, and a lot of people, to me at Oxford, said, why do you want us to apologize for the deeds of the past? Why are you bringing up dead people? And that's something you also say in the book. Why should we apologize today for the deeds of the past? Why should we go back on what the colonialists did? Because we didn't do it. You sure as hell did not suffer. So why are we apologizing to you today? And it sort of brings me back to, what about Pitt Rivers Museum as such? What about the very colonialist, very racist display of artifacts within the museum? And what is Oxford's standpoint on making that display more respectful towards the dead? Weapons specifically that were taken, that were looted from war sites, that were literally stripped off from dead bodies of soldiers in the past, and that have been displayed in this grotesque display of might is right, and Pitt Rivers and his ability to bring all these weapons all the way to England and then ship them all the way to Oxford, because apparently he didn't want British Museum to inherit his collection. He didn't like the idea of geographical alignment of these things. He wanted to show how these weapons show stages of human primitive behavior, and how the British Empire is at the pinnacle of it. It's at the pinnacle of modernity. So, what do you think is the future for Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, or universities like Oxford, where such movements arise but are then shut down by people saying you cannot deny the people their contributions because of some acts of violence that they did in the past?
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. So I think, I mean, I'm more hopeful than maybe you made it sound then. And maybe maybe I would be, and maybe I would love to hear, more reasons why we should not be hopeful. But I think just look at the evidence, which is that Rhodes has fallen in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Cape Town. Even in London, there was the denaming of a council house and that was a campaign that started in the 1980s. There's the denaming of the museum that is associated with his birthplace that happened in 2021. In the same way as there were movements to remove the Civil War monuments from across the American South as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And as I talk about in those opening sections of the book, in the case of Oxford in the United States, in the American South, rather than in the UK, another Oxford, there was an image of a Confederate soldier where there was a campaign to have it moved or removed that went on for years, and people had felt that that was a failure. And then after 50 years, in the summer of 2020, eventually it fell. There's always a risk, as I gave in that example at Docklands in London, that a fallen monument may be re-erected. And there's that risk. I think we might see it under Trump. Who knows? I wouldn't say it's always wrong to put a monument back up. What's important is that there is a democratic process and we understand what this monument is. And if these are monuments, as in the case of the Civil War, to the so-called lost cause, to the denial that the Civil War is over, that the end of enslavement happened, then that's obviously incredibly dangerous. So this is about sort of transparency in terms of those, processes. And so, thinking about what counts, how we sort of hold on to monuments and how we don't, is obviously essential. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? There was another part of it which I've somehow lost in answering it.
Pitt Rivers, what do you see? How do you see the museum changing? Because you're also at the helm of Pitt Rivers while you were talking about how flawed the museum is in the book.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think these are ongoing. This is what does that sort of democratic process look like when it comes to not only Pitt Rivers but to world culture museums around the world. Now, we've never needed something like a world culture museum. We've never needed something like the discipline of anthropology more than we do in the present. We need these ways of thinking about thinking, about believing, about making, understanding, outside of a Western or Eurocentric lens. We've never needed that space and that, the museum as a public space more than we do at the present. But that doesn't mean that displays that sort of celebrate the militaristic vision that was at the heart of the birth of sort of modern material culture studies. And remember, for your listeners, that's what this book argues. I mean, I argue that, the whole notion, modern notion of sort of material culture, it's inherent even just in that term, material culture, that this is about the Pitt Rivers organization of weaponry, the idea of the progress of sort of weaponry, which he then applies to from weapons. From the Museum of Weapons, he turns it into a museum of everything. And that's where the violence really comes in, and it sort of quietly comes in. So yeah, how do we dismantle that? How do we return artifacts when they've been looted? How do we remake the museum? I think by generalizing out, so it's not purely, as I say at one point in the book, this can't be just about returning the Benin bronzes. And if you're returning the Benin bronzes, you have to talk about, well, we are undoing forms of racism. We're not just sort of giving back what accidentally got looted or robbed. This is a part of a wider set of structures, which is about reimagining anthropology. What's interesting about our museums is they are out of step with where the disciplines are. Anthropology is a long way away from where it was in the 19th century, and our museums are spaces in which those histories sort of persist, because they were built for that. And that's the point of the book. They were built as sort of monuments. So we need to, if we think sort of theoretically that this is not only about things or objects indoors in museums, it's about monuments, it's about knowledge, it's about the books on the library shelf, as much as it's about objects in museums, then maybe we begin to get somewhere. And maybe we need to, realize institutionally that there is a duty of care to the people that you described earlier, of you being invited into. You find yourself in the Institute of Archaeology, and it can be, this is a legacy colonial space, without a doubt. Even though in this case, the Institute of Archaeology was sort of set up after the war, so it's sort of broadly an establishment of the supposedly, decolonial or the post-colonial, or certainly the post-war, situation. And yet, of course, this is a space in which those sort of legacies are among their most vivid. It's case by case. There are people unnaming the professorships that are named after the geographers that carved up, the world into empire. There is work ongoing to talk about, removing the name of Sackler because people don't want to go and read archaeology books in a library named after a drug dealer. These are all part of the wider set of arguments over memory culture, and fundamentally over how we think about the culture of benefaction. This in part begins in the development office, in the fundraising. How is it that, what is this history of sort of giving to institutions that's about the naming or the art washing of the money of certain colonists, or certain people involved in, things like the Sacklers? How have we got to the point where we're taking the Sacklers' money and then we're unnaming the Sackler Library? Yet we can't do so with Cecil Rhodes. And really the only argument about Cecil Rhodes, well, there were two arguments. One was a supposed argument that no donor's ever going to give you money, although obviously we've undone the Sackler much faster. And the second thing, which is the unspoken thing, which was just a nudge from government to say, don't you dare take that image down, or else. And the speaking out of at the time, the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor of Oxford, even though Oriel College is a self-governing college, and the Rhodes Trust is in Oxford, but not of Oxford. This is not a department of the University of Oxford. Nonetheless, those people felt they could speak out alongside, Mary Beard, and alongside all sorts of other, voices, sometimes surprising voices, who missed the history. And I think this is the key thing. These are intergenerational struggles. So we are a bit like restitution. Every time it comes up, we're encouraged to talk about this as if we go back to first principles. This is about ethics. This is about almost like we're having a sort of Oxford Union debate about this question, as if it is. I'm sorry, I just had a phone call coming in, which I will try and shut my WhatsApp down. So fundamentally, this is about seeking to remember that we don't have to. Sorry, how do I turn that off? There we go. Yeah. So this is about resisting the idea that we can only respond to this in the present, and remember, as if this is the first time anyone's had this conversation, the first time anyone has thought about these questions. returning to the Benin bronzes after 25 years, after the big push on the 100-year anniversary of the Benin attack and the pioneering work of Bernie Grant MP and others, and many Nigerian colleagues at the time who felt that they had lost. 25 years later, at the 125th anniversary, the returns began. So yeah, that's at the heart of this, is to remember that all of these conversations, they happen sort of piece by piece. This isn't about the pulling down of a whole edifice. It's not an attack upon the University of Oxford. It's not an attack upon museums. It's simply about how we manage change, heritage management, managing these histories, not necessarily reform, but sometimes abolition, the awareness that the work of abolition and emancipation is not over. And we see that from the work of African-American colleagues who have made the case that abolition has moved from the plantation to the prison. In the long history of carcerality, it may well turn out that the museum is far from an irrelevant space, that actually the history of regimes of carcerality begins with enslavement. At the point of emancipation, the dead begin to be imprisoned in a way that the living had been, and they've begun to be bought and sold for 100 years or so, until the 1940s, when the carceral regimes move into mass incarceration. And that's not an unbelievable sort of chronology, but it's not a chronology that we're familiar with, and it's one that we need to think through. So yeah, I mean, we're not going. You're never going to decolonize the Pitt Rivers Museum or the British Museum, but that doesn't mean that these aren't spaces of, or they can't be spaces of reparation, restitution, remembrance, repair, that they can't be sites of conscience, that they can't be dismantled in part and retained in other ways. So yeah, the work of conservation. At one point, I talk about this sort of lecture given by the artist Robert Smithson, where he talks about the world as being constantly like a building site where the ruins of the past are being made and unmade at the same time. And that's just how the world is. I mean, I absolutely have that same vision of that the land artists of the 70s observed. I mean, they had read archaeology enough to understand that this is how archaeologists understand the world. We can sort of bring that archaeological knowledge, those sort of methods, those ways of seeing, which have a relationship to colonialism. This is a legacy colonial discipline, but we can misuse these tools and use them for good. We can, and that at the heart of the book, of course, is a reflection on the work of Audre Lorde and the famous lecture she gave in 1979, which is one where people often sort of don't look past the title. And the title of the lecture, of course, is The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And that's not what she didn't mean this as a sort of we have to burn it all down, we have to give up, we have to this was actually a very specific take upon forms of white feminism and how you ensure that feminism is sort of truly diverse in those ways. So yeah, there is hope for misusing these tools of the museum, of archaeology as a discipline, and even of forms of the monumental. We can reimagine the monumental in different ways.
No, thank you so much for that idea, because to me, as a reader now, and not so much as a person asking questions for the benefit of our audience, to me, the book spoke about owning up to the idea that these ideas, as you say, can have a boomerang effect. If not dealt with, if not addressed, if awareness is not created about the colonial legacy of certain things, they can come back to us in a new bottle, like fascism did, which we saw in the case of the Pitt Rivers family itself, where his grandson was the notorious fascist. And these ideas sort of keep coming back like a boomerang generally does and hitting the society again and making all these ideas of xenophobia, of otherworldism, of racism even more pronounced, even if we don't call them just that. Coming back to the skull cap, because we have questions coming in, and at this point, I would encourage our audience to use the chat box feature, type in your question so that we can take it up. And if you can't, for some reason, access the chat box feature, which has happened in the past, please use the WhatsApp group that you are all in so that we can ask your questions at the end of this chat. But one last question from me is the skull cap, and you do mention that the skull cap also had a parallel with Lord Byron, who found something similar in his grounds and then turned it into a skull cap for himself. You talk about how Pitt Rivers bought it from a person called the Armorer, and you refer to that name throughout without mentioning the person. Now, I do know we agreed to not naming certain people for the benefit of not.
It's in the end notes. Yeah.
Oh, it's in the end notes.
Yep.
Oh, yes, we haven't quite reached the end notes yet. But I was curious about his identity, and does that tell us anything about the identity of the woman?
Yes. So the history of the skull cup. So I did my best as an archaeologist to trace that back, and found this person's body turned into the skull cup in the Pitt Rivers collection, the second collection on his estate on the Wiltshire-Dorset border. It's there in the catalogue in 1884, having been bought at Sotheby's, and it's identified as being in his dining room. So he's definitely using it at that point in that way. He buys it from the estate of a man who was known as the Armourer, Bernhardt Smith. He was a neighbour of Augustus Pitt Rivers in London, lived around the corner, and someone who attended learned societies with him. Bernard Smith may have received the item because the silver mark is from 1838, which is an interesting year. It's the year of the coronation of Queen Victoria. It's also the year of the one of the key sort of moments in the emancipation of enslaved people in the Caribbean. And originally, when it was first described in the Sotheby's catalogue, there was a head of Victoria, a coin with the head of the Queen in the middle of it, in the bottom of the skull. So presumably, originally, this was used to toast, Queen and country. And that man's father, it's like I say, it's all in the endnotes, and I decided to, de-center that man's history, but I'm happy to tell you about it. That man's father had been a commander in the Royal Navy in the West Indies, so it's not impossible. It would be a reasonable fit for this relic or trophy of some colonial massacre or other, or some simply dehumanization or resistance in the context of abolition and emancipation, for this woman's skull to find its way back as on a Royal Navy ship and be turned into a cup, maybe, as I point out, to celebrate the graduation of that man from Oriel College. Entirely coincidentally, he went to Oriel College and read law before he went to be called to the bar in Middle Temple in London. And so Middle Temple in London, where he sort of practiced, was also right around the corner from the College of Surgeons, where many of these heads ended up, and arguably where maybe or maybe not Augustus Pitt Rivers's own skull ended up, as I say at the end of the book. So yeah, we're able to trace, but that's the point. We are seeking to sort of trace back through these men in order to try and understand the undocumented history of this woman. And that's why the names aren't given, and why I call him, by the name that he was known, but by the nickname, as it were, and not the real name, because I do think it's important that, the figure of the armourer, or the figure of the governor of Jamaica, or the figure of the grandfather general, as I call Pitt Rivers, which again was not his real name. And of course, actually in the book, I call sort of Pitt Rivers Fox, which was his real name. That's Augustus Henry Lane Fox. And so names are incredibly important. And as the book, I use all sorts of things. I use Ursula Le Guin's rule of names at one point, and so sci-fi there, but also the names of who we cite, the names of who we read. This is a book that could not have been written without the work of Saidiya Hartman, of Stuart Hall, of Sylvia Wynter, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire. I mean, these voices, these writers and thinkers are central. And I think if there's one takeaway from all of that for sort of your group here, it has to be that our reading, 90% of writing is reading, right? We are reading all the time, but who are we reading? Which books are we reading? Who are we centering? I did reread a lot of Pitt Rivers, and I do, summarize some of his lectures simply in order to underline, how awful some of this stuff was. But in order to understand that and write about it, I'm using thinkers from a long way outside archaeology, from literary studies. I'm reading Maggie Nelson. I'm reading, other people, Roland Barthes, or Levi-Strauss. So reading widely and reading eclectically and finding the ideas where we, that match from outside of our discipline is central, because archaeology isn't such a big field ultimately, and it's actually very unlikely that any really good ideas are going to come from within the tiny number of several thousand archaeologists. There's no reason why we would want to hold ourselves back from, surely, reading and learning from the critical fabulation of Saidiya Hartman, reading and learning from the images of the world of statues from Fanon, reading Césaire not on the boomerang, which is a mistranslation, but on the choc en retour, and the difference between those two models, or those two metaphors. The boomerang, which is a metaphor from Hannah Arendt and from Sartre's introduction to Fanon's book, versus the Fanon-Césaire image of the choc en retour, which is more like a kickback. It's more like it's a completely different image of how colonialism can impact upon the colonizer. The movement of the boomerang in its soft way round and being caught in the hand or whatever, versus actually the recoil of the gun, which is much more like what we're talking about here. So that image of the choc en retour is another example. So yeah, names matter. Who do we name? Who do we don't? Next time any of you are writing about one of these histories, why don't you try the experiment I did? Just try not to say the guy's name. This was collected by a major general, not Major General XYZ. We don't need to fill our books and our manuscripts with these names. Someone can always go and look them up. Let's not recenter the colonizer. Let's not only have the names of men or white men in these histories. Let's see what happens if we think about the politics of who gets named and who doesn't.
No, totally agree with that. I think the one big takeaway, again, as a reader and not a person facilitating this dialogue today, is I loved that there was a sense of poetic justice in denaming the colonizers, because that's what's essentially happened to the people who owned these artifacts, or who owned these bodies in the case of the Skull Cup. We don't know who they are. They are completely dehumanized. Death of these people has been sold in the West far too long and has been termed dark heritage, and death clearly sells, as you can see with the number of mummies we have housed in the museums in UK, where they're just objectified and dehumanized. And it's almost as if you're looking at an object and not a person who lived and breathed and had ideas or had thoughts and emotions just like we do. So to me, there was a sense of poetic justice where you decide not to name the colonizers, the people who are appropriating these artifacts, just using their might over people who were oppressed or enslaved. And And that sort of brings me to the Q&A for our session today. And Simran will take over from here because she's got questions of her own, and there are questions coming up in the chat box. And for those of you who have questions, we do encourage you to ask them.
Again, thank you so much for such a fascinating discussion. I think we've said this before as well, but we've been gushing about the book, and there's just so much to discuss, so many questions, and even after this discussion. So I'll start with one of my own. I think we briefly touched upon this earlier, just before we started the talk. We were discussing about the Mughals exhibition at the V&A, and other various such exhibitions like the Ancient India one that's running right now in the British Museum. And I remember just visiting the Mughals exhibition in its end days, and it had been hyped around quite a lot by people. It's an excellent exhibition. It's giving you access to all of these unseen artifacts of the Mughal dynasty, which personally I have only seen images of in my history textbooks. And I think I say that for all the Indians present here. We haven't seen these objects ever, or we don't even know where these objects are. And then finally, you come to this exhibition, you pay 25 to 30 pounds, and you see them there. And the one thing that sort of goes amiss is that they use the sense of ornamentation and opulence to mask exactly how these objects ended up there. And that was a big disappointment. And that becomes a more bigger disappointment because these are the very museums that are talking about collaborations, starting programs that we are collaborating with the archaeologists or with heritage professionals, with conservators back in all of these former colonies to give them access to knowledge. But where exactly is this collaboration happening, and what do we truly mean when we say collaborate and give access to knowledge, give access or give a voice to these communities in these very spaces? So what do you have to say about that?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Really, really important set of questions. How do you solve a problem like the Victoria and Albert Museum? I mean, I think one of the it's a theme, of course, in the book, the link, which I think a lot of people won't kind of realize the relationship in between the Pitt Rivers collection as the first collection as it's known, the Oxford collection, and South Kensington, which was where Pitt Rivers wanted. Well, he did exhibit. I mean, it was exhibited on the site of what we now call the V&A in between 1878 and in 1882, and it had sort of before that been in the East London Museum, the Bethnal Green Museum, which is now the museum. Well, it was renamed the Museum of Childhood. They now called it Young V&A. And if you go in there, you will, if you can see past what they've done with the building since, you will see a, physical space which has the same sort of railway-like kind of feel to the Pitt Rivers itself. So there are intellectual links in between the V&A and the Pitt Rivers. In some ways, yeah, the instrumentalization of exhibitionary practice in order to create dialogue or partnership, or the circulationist argument that we shouldn't do restitution because we can move items about from one location to another. These old ideas, which of course the V&A was very central to. It had a circulationist approach to other museums in the UK over the course of the 20th century. I mean, remember the V&A once upon a time had an outpost in Dublin where they displayed, Benin bronzes, at a point at which Ireland was not yet, free. So the intimate relationship of that circulationist idea in terms of internal colonization or in terms of external partnership building and thereby forms of soft diplomacy and so on are important. I mean, fundamentally, I think exactly like with restitution, it's the same for any part of these regimes of sort of visuality or display. This has to be about consent. And I remember when the Sarsavois report into restitutions that came out in 2018, I was a visiting professor at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, the big anthropology collections there. And while all the curators were very in favour, actually, as most curators are, those under the age of 60 or whatever, most people, it's a normal perspective that, of course, restitution is something we need to do on a case-by-case basis. That is normal. But a lot of people I talked to did not understand, from the Sarr-Savoy report, what is this language of consent doing there? Why is this language of, sexual violence? What is that kind of doing in our museums? But of course, consent in the past and consent in the present is what this is all about. So, was the item, taken with consent? Was it even an inalienable item that was so much part of a society, of an ancestral presence or whatever, that it could never be given away, even if sort of willingly, supposedly, but also about consent in the present. And that's where the comments that Shreya made right at the end there about subjects become very important. And I use Hartman to some degree for this, but also I take it in my own sort of direction. The idea of subjection and subjectification and objectification, who gets to be counted as a subject, who gets to be treated as an object, but also the idea of archaeology as a subject rather than a discipline. We can play around with those images of objects and subjects in order to ask, well, where is the subjection through objects going on in an exhibition like that? Who is being treated as a subject and who is being subjected or subjectified or objectified in those ways? And I think these are, how much is this about ultimately, giving up some of this power or control? Surely that is what consent involves. What would consent look like in an exhibition of that kind? And how do we make sense of, well, if it's not hurting, it's not working for museums, right? I mean, that's got to be part of this, because there is work here that involves a dismantling of what is, in this form of colonialism, this sort of deterritorialized form, finds a location in London, but where consent may lie elsewhere as well. And so I don't know. I agree that I think there are some very, very good people that work for the V&A and for other such institutions who are trying their best. I think for some of these institutions, there's some really, cynical leadership that are trying to, to sort of walk the walk, walk the decolonial walk while actually changing absolutely nothing, and it's just business as usual. And what does resistance look like in this case? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the reviews or the responses were to that exhibition. Or you mentioned earlier there's one at the British Museum at the moment. Is that right, on India? That I think it's the ball's in your court really to write about, because so much of the pushback has to be about writing about this. Write back better. Make your own exhibition and sort of do it in a different way. That is, finding the resource and the ability to do that is obviously a challenge. But finding, choosing your partners and thinking hard about that and trying to remake forms of curation which are genuinely sort of co-curation rather than the same old would be good.
Thank you very much for that. And I think what you said about resistance and the running main theme in your book, hope for how the story will end, I think that really stuck with me. And we do see some instances as well, and hopefully these will magnify, because I used to work with English Heritage, and I had a few colleagues who worked at Apsley House, Duke of Wellington. And when I was reading that portion in your book, it just suddenly came to my mind that a few years back, I think it was 2019, just before COVID, they did a exhibition on young Wellington in India. So his connections to East India Company. And when you go to Apsley House, you can see these objects, although they're hidden from plain sight. They are marketed again as decorative objects, nothing more about them. But then I have this one colleague. He says that he can't do it on an official level, but he'll still take visitors around and do talks and tours highlighting his connection to the East India Company and what they actually did. And I feel like these small acts of resistance, if piled up over time, can make a big change. So
Yeah.
that is something that we can all really take away from that.
Absolutely, and I think it's what happens in our museums. It's what happens at the V&A. It's what happens at the British Museum. You know, there are little acts of resistance going on. You know, the majority of people that work for the British Museum think they should, of course, they should give back the Benin bronzes, and they should, you know, get the Africa galleries out of the basement. But whether leadership and the trustees are going to do that, that's another question. Where the hope lies, it's the same for the National Trust. So much of the great innovative work in the UK done by the trust is done because of the devolved nature of the trust. You know, it's happening at the sites. It's not necessarily happening in the centre. You know, I mean, they got their fingers, or they felt they got their fingers burnt when they did the big report into the legacies of slavery, and since then, at a national level, have been very, very cautious about these issues. Whereas at a local level, there's this, you know, it's sort of let a thousand flowers, you know, bloom, and that is helpful because some of that is going to be, you know, able to advance these agendas, and that's the hope. You know, there's a lot of this stuff out there. The sheer scale is something that can help us, because that was the same with the Benin bronzes. Remember that as a campaigning book, the main thing that the British Museums did was have that list at the end of it that said, how near are you at this moment from a looted Benin bronze? And here is a list of where they all are. And it's, you know, from sort of Washington, DC to, you know, to Berlin, to, you know, to Paris, to Nigeria, you know, here's where they all are. And so you're never that far from, and so this is a local conversation, and we could have that conversation. A conversation could start in each of those locations. It has to be the same for these issues as well, for these questions of monuments and memory, but also forms of institutional display.
No, that's very true. And I think that brings me to one last question from my side, and then I'll take the other questions as well. It's about heritage values, because you do talk about them quite a lot. And I'm also dealing with those in my research, looking and even at speaking archaeologically, because we are dealing with sites, vulnerable sites back in India, mostly also as a result of the colonial listings that happened, the surveying that happened. The whole debate in the Victorian period about what do you conserve, what do you restore, what do you mean by restoration, and how, as we discussed early on here as well, that all of those ideas have shifted in a way here, not fully, but to some extent. And then it's expected that you do sort of transport the same things back in the former colonies as well, without actually sort of dealing with the issue at hand, because we still exist with that colonial legacy. You add on a layer of nationalism, bureaucracy also on top of that. So how do we exactly deal with it?
So yeah, as I began saying earlier, you know, maybe 20 years ago we had this sort of value-led heritage approach. Recently, we've seen from historic England and elsewhere the promotion under the former government, the former Conservative government, of ideas of economic value at the heart of heritage, and it's that sense that, you know, value should be understood simply in terms, you know, hold on to something which is worth some money. And I guess part of the argument might somehow, in some warped sense, be that if you hold on to the Cecil Rhodes monument, it's because it was associated with with a very wealthy man that gave some money, not exactly sort of to the university, but certainly to the college. And therefore, you know, the fact that he gave money in order to, because he personally believed, because of his form of white supremacy, that he had to be remembered for 4,000 years, that somehow he therefore has to be in death. He has to be, his ideas have to be respected as in life. And, you know, that seems completely to understand, as I say somewhere in the book, the price of everything and the value of nothing. You know, when a community wants something different from, you know, one rich dead man. I mean, this is about the super rich, right? This is about how we think about this. And there is a line that runs from Augustus Pitt Rivers FRS to Elon Musk FRS. I mean, there is their membership of the Royal Society, the Fellowship of the Royal Society FRS, is a part of this. You know, there are inheritances from Pitt Rivers the colonist into Pitt Rivers the fascist, into the Pitt Rivers Museum now, and this world in which we see a new form of fascism emerging. And how do we name it? How do we see it? How do we think about our role when you have, you know, Musk? I left X because of this, of course, but, you know, you have Musk actively trying to weaponize archaeology, ideas of civilization, ideas of the West as being under attack for the purposes of, you know, white supremacy. You know, that's incredibly dangerous, but it means that, you know, we in our discipline are implicated. And remember that Michael Rothberg, the incredible writer about the legacies of the Holocaust, reminds us in his book Implicated Subjects that the etymology of the word implication is to be folded in. So you are implicated, you're not the perpetrator of this ongoing violence, these ongoing forms of, you know, subjection or objectification or dehumanization, but you are involved, you are folded in. And how to think about that, you know, is it possible to unfold yourself in some way, or to undo this origami of this discipline that we inherit? Fundamentally, it's about how to inherit well, whatever that means, and maybe even to inherit on a non-heteronormative sort of patriarchal way. What if we had a different set of words that weren't about the patrimoine or the patrimony, as the French would call it, you know, not about heritage, as we would call it in English, which has all of this. And I say, you know, actually Pitt Rivers didn't use the word heritage. He talked about monuments. It's the fascist grandson that was deep into the word heritage. So are there other ways of thinking about intergenerational endurance and survival? How can we celebrate those people that did survive, you know, who are at the sharp end of all of this, rather than holding on to those people that, you know, that made themselves endure? So if there's one image that your listeners sort of go away with, maybe it is the difference between the human beings that survived, that resisted and survived, and those people who turned themselves into stone or bronze in order to make themselves endure. And how do we think about those different forms of humanity and value? You know, who do we look to for value? Do we look to the thing, or do we look to the person and to the community?
That's so very true. And I think following from that, I am going to take the last two questions, and they are related to this discussion that we just had. So Diptarak asks, in India, we sometimes see the removal of statues of former colonialists from public spaces, or replacing these statues with those of Indian freedom fighters. However, to what extent do you think this actually helps in obliterating the public memory of the individuals involved, especially when these decisions are taken by the governments in power without enough public consultation? In other words, is removal of these statues enough to let the matter to rest?
Yeah. Okay, it's a really, really important question. So yeah, I think the democratic process for how to reshape public space and public memory is important. Do not allow those who want to intervene in these conversations to say this is about history, it's about memory. And do not allow them to say it's about the man, it's about the monument, right? We need to hold on to that. And there are two mottos for this book. I began giving my books mottos a few years ago, and I highly recommend it. So for the last book, the motto was, as the border is to the nation state, so the museum is to empire. So the museum and the border are both 19th century technologies which are designed for the classification of human beings into one category or another. And I was interested in that book about the common histories, and that came very much out of the work I did on the Calais jungle for the book Land, which, if anyone's interested, you can download online for free. LAND, Land. So the two mottos for this book are a bit different. One is stay with the fragments. Sometimes you have to hold on to the history, you know, in its broken forms, and the disarticulation and the violence that is done to bodies and histories and knowledge and memory. You don't necessarily have to always stick that all back together and cross mend, as we would say in archaeology, to to find every last sherd and cross mend it so the vessel is remade whole. That isn't actually what we're necessarily doing when we're doing archaeology. You can stay with the fragments, but equally the second motto is sometimes the gap is the monument. And that gap, I was in Stanford on a visiting lectureship last year. I talk about it right at the end of the book. And, you know, there was a statue of one of these race scientists. I'm not even going to say his name now. Why should I? Yeah, mention him again. And, you know, they just in over lockdown, you know, the image was removed. And as you come up now, the drive and up to this sort of arc of sort of buildings and so on, you know, there's just a gap. And if you know, you know. If you don't know, it doesn't matter. You know, there's no sign. And this whole ideology of retain and explain is so crazy that you have to hold on to every last sort of garden gnome that you might, every last, you know, thing that anyone might have, and then sort of put a sign up sort of rather than change it. It's just nonsense, and everyone knows it's nonsense. I'll very quickly, if I have time, sort of give you one example. When, you know, at the height of all this nonsense from the sort of culture warrior right, there's a woman called Nadine Dorries who became the culture minister here in the UK. And within 36 hours of her taking over in the September of 2021, she had emergency unlisted, and so delisted, a site called the Dorman Long Tower on Teesside. And it was dynamited overnight. They had it officially dynamited because she thought it should go. It was a 20th century monument of industrial heritage in the northeast of England. Several months later, she emergency listed against the approval or the guidance of Historic England again. She emergency listed the memorial to where Cecil Rhodes used to live when he was an undergraduate, his digs, with this very, you know, odd and certainly not important, you know, artistically or certainly not of value to the community, memorial that was going to be removed by Oriel College. So within a matter of months, through her own judgment, her own I mean, she's an elected politician, but still, she made the decision against the democratic sort of decisions of the, of the college, against what so many people had been fighting for the Dorman Long Tower to be kept, against the expert advice on both occasions of Historic England, that, oh no, that gets blown up and this gets held onto. And that's important to me because I come from a long line of coal miners, and my father was a coal miner and his father was a coal miner. And his father in the 1920s worked at a site, at a colliery, and so did my father actually work at a colliery that had earlier been owned by Dorman Long. So Dorman Long was a name in my family history. It was a name, you know, miners and their, you know, and their loss of life and their work and their, you know, their labour is not often remembered. You know, that part of the northeast of England is a site of continual sort of clearance and where people's lives are not remembered. But she chose, Nadine Dorries chose that this is the 20th century monument they want to keep, which is about a colonist's history. This is the monument that they're going to destroy, which is about so important for tens of thousands of people across the northeast of England, or hundreds of thousands with a link to the industrial heritage of the northeast, that they were going to destroy it. And that just goes to show this is willful, that it's an understanding of the power of the gap, or of the survival of what Michel Rolfe Trujillo calls the mention or the silence. But we have to have a democratic and community-based approach to how we reshape sort of landscapes. And I think the destruction of Dorman Long, along with the story I tell about the desecration of those Epstein sculptures, which you'll see in the book if you read it, on what is now Zimbabwe House. And next time anyone's in London, if you take the book with you, you can read that section as you go along. So yeah, it's a reminder that the gap, sometimes the gap is the monument, for better or for worse.
Thank you so much for that. And I think I will just do the last question because this has been such an engaging discussion, but we did not realize where the time went.
Yes, I know it's almost 2 hours now, isn't it? So that's a long
yeah.
time. And also at some point I need to move around and to, and to get on with my day as well. But it's been such fun, and it's gone incredibly fast, hasn't it? Thank you for all of your amazing questions.
No problem. So it's the Tariq again, and he asks, in recent news, the auctioning of some of the Buddha's relics and sacred jewels by a private art dealer was discussed. Although the art dealer postponed the sale of these relics upon legal action by the Indian government, do you think postponement still poses a risk to these pre-colonial and ancient archaeological remains that are unaccounted for in many private art markets and can be sold off without any legal action?
Absolutely. So everyone listening to this has got to do more on this question. I think we all have to do more on this question of the sale of ancestral human remains. I think it's in the UK, in India, elsewhere in the world, it is astounding that this is continuing. The relics of the Buddha. I mean, it's just, you couldn't make it up, could you? As an extreme example, I would encourage you to follow David Batty, who is the Guardian journalist who is managing to pick up these stories. He's also the person that sort of reported really well on the Worcester College Oxford elements of my book. And so David Batty, I think, is sort of doing some really good reporting on this. So watch that space, because I think he might be doing some more over human remains. But yeah, what does the campaigning look like? What does the social media look like in terms of the demand for an abolition of the buying and selling of human bodies? You can't do this for living people. Why on earth would you be able to do it for the dead? There's also an argument for licensing. So in the UK, when it came to the licensing of human tissue, for those old enough to remember, I am old enough to remember that in the 1990s, there were the great scandals and outrages over the retention of human tissue of babies in Alderhay, in sort of Liverpool, and in Bristol. And in the wake of that, and then last time we had a new Labour government, there was a change in the policy under the Human Tissue Act of 2004 that meant that any human tissue from 1948, which was the year of the founding of the NHS onwards, would have to be licensed, and there would have to be evidence of sort of consent for those bodies to be kept, or those organs, or whatever it was, to be kept. But anything sort of before 1948, of course, for everyone in this room, 1948 is a very interesting year. It's not just about the founding of the NHS, right? So, this was a line in the sand that was drawn on the basis that, well, eventually our museums they're going to fess up to what they've got. They'll do this long, sort of complicated work of the recording of the bodies. It takes a long time. Come on. But that was now 20, 25 years ago. And if anything, we know less now about ancestral remains in our museums in the UK than we did back then. So there's a big argument, and one that I make, and you can look at it. Maybe you can share the link at some point to the all-party parliamentary group report that we issued in March. I wrote the afterword, and there's some very good work there being led by Bel Ribeiro Addy MP. But it's an all-party group. There have been some very, very important discussions in the Lords, in the House of Lords, and so you can look at Hansard on these questions as well. And I think I'm hopeful that we're going to see a change in the law when it comes to sale, but also surely registration. If you have to, museums, we license firearms. You can't have guns in museums without having a license of what's there. Why on earth would you not also do the same for human remains? So there we go. These are people's ancestors, right? So that's one of the hopes I hope we have with this book. It's a complicated narrative to get across in the media, to be able to say, well, it's a book about ancestors and about statues, and the two are woven sort of together. But I hope, and thank you both. I mean, your evidence, Simran and Shreya, evidence that it is a book that that people can read and sort of come to terms with, and can hopefully gain from. Like I say, some people have been reading the book actually with the audiobook. It's also available in PDF form and so on. So, but however you sort of prefer to read, I do hope that it's something that all of your audience will find of some use. There's a good index as well. I did the index myself, so I can recommend the index. Often the first part of the book that I begin with is an index. You can also, as a final thing, sort of just to say, how to write about these issues and finding the right tone is incredibly important. And part of the way in which I did that is sort of talked about in the acknowledgements. I mean, the book was written at a time of sort of personal loss, and that I think made the book so much better. Even though it was a sad time, it was a time where I think I was forced to remember that I was writing about human beings and loss and death and sort of dehumanization. And so to remember the humanity of the people that we write about in museums, and to remember that we shouldn't mistake the colonizers for being immortal, that was all relevant. So you can read that in the acknowledgements anyway.
On that note, we bring this amazing session to an end, which sort of is a wrench to me because I could go on and I would still take you up if you're in Brighton. If you're open to meeting me while you're still here,
absolutely.
There's so many aspects to it that I would still love to discuss with you.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just very quickly share a link here. Some of you might be, for those in the UK, how do I share the link? There we go in the chat. Is that okay? There's a link to my talks. Just go to danhicks.uk/talks. That will be updated as we go along. But in the autumn, I'm going to be doing, and so there is an event at Houseman's on the 11th of June, if anyone's in London, which is a Wednesday. But there's also going to be a whole series of events across the UK, from Oxford to Bristol to Edinburgh and to London, at a series of sort of radical bookshops. So it would be great if, and maybe we can do one of those sort of together. We can see if any of those dates work for you. Yeah.
Definitely. But coming back to the book again, for those of you who haven't read it, I have. I finished it this morning, actually. Haven't gotten as far as the end notes, which I'm looking forward to. I started reading this book with the acknowledgements, which sort of made more sense to me, because this whole idea of grief and death and how it should be handled, which came from a very personal spot in your case, sort of made the reading experience even more vivid to me, and sort of spoke to me as a person who not only deals with archaeology, but essentially deals with dead human beings, because that is what all archaeology is. It's a science of the remains of what once was. So those of you who haven't read the book or want to still take a look at the book, this is what it looks like. It's called Every Monument Will Fall, and it is readily available everywhere. Amazon is something that everybody in India uses and abuses, regardless of how much we disagree with their policies as a company. You will very easily find it on Amazon as well. So we highly recommend this book. It's probably the least archaeological book written by an archaeologist. In the middle, a lot of people might argue, because I think Professor Hicks explains his point of view there as well, it's not a biography. It is not. Contrary to what you might think, or contrary to what it might feel like for you, it's not a biography. If anything, it is the denaming of a person. It is the destructuralization of a person. It's the disintegration of who General Pitt Rivers was, who we've chosen carefully not to name too many times in the talk today. Thank you so much, Professor Hicks. This went by way too fast for our liking because, like I said, there's just so much to talk about. It sits so well with what we want to do as an organization at Speaking Archaeologically, what we've been doing